Um, Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New York State Budget and Policy Briefing of Governor Kathy Hochul, delivered by Secretary of State Robert Rodriguez. Today's program will begin in about 1 minute. We're going to give people some time to file in, get a cup of coffee, relax, enjoy themselves, and we'll have about an hour-long discussion with our Secretary of State on all things budget and policy in New York State. We're very happy to have Robert Rodriguez. So we will begin in approximately 1 minute. Good morning and welcome to the New York State Executive Budget presentation by Secretary of State Robert Rodriguez on behalf of New York State Governor Kathy Hochul. We're delighted to welcome you here today by the Bronx Chamber of Commerce. And for introductory remarks, we have our President, Lisa Soren, followed by Liz Neumark, founder and CEO of Great Performances. Lisa?
Good morning, and I apologize. My camera is not working, and it's almost like a Monday today. First of all, I want to thank the Secretary of State, Robert Rodriguez, for joining us this morning. This is a super important topic for us, and understanding the vision of our governor, which so much of it really is supportive of the work that we're trying to do in the Bronx. So I'm really excited to get into some of the details about it. Welcome to all our participants. I also will need to jump off, not to be rude. I am simultaneously doing MTA committee work today. So I am multitasking, but I could not move my day without saying thank you to the Secretary of State and being able to understand all that is going on. And I look forward to learning more. And good morning to all the panelists. And Michael, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And now, as her reputation precedes her, as the secretary noted earlier, we have Liz Neumark, founder and CEO of Great Performances Catering, the largest women-owned catering company in New York State and one of the largest in North America. Liz is joining us from her office in the South Bronx, and we are so delighted to have her here today. Liz?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Lisa. And a special thanks to my fellow board members, all our community stakeholders, and Bronx Chamber members that are joining us today to learn more about Governor Hochul's budget and policy proposals. We share a common bond in wanting the very best future for New York State, and that begins here in the Bronx, a borough that has welcomed me and that I'm incredibly proud to call my company's home. I have the honor of welcoming Secretary of State Robert Rodriguez to our briefing today. Secretary Rodriguez is a friend of the Bronx and a powerful voice for Latinos throughout the state and the country. Secretary Rodriguez was nominated by Governor Kathy Hochul to serve as our 68th Secretary of State and is a uniquely accomplished leader and former legislator with civic and legislative successes that have been focused strategically on investing in and developing public good infrastructure projects, creating good paying jobs, and addressing financial disparities for historically underrepresented minorities and low-income communities. Mr. Rodriguez is a former member of the New York State Assembly for 11 years, focused on protecting and creating affordable housing, bringing good jobs into the community, and ensuring our children receive a quality education. Private sector resume is equally impressive, having served as a director at the Public Financial Management, the leading municipal financial advisor in the nation. Prior to PFM, Mr. Rodriguez was a vice president at AC Advisory Incorporated and held various management and operational roles at Bloomberg LP. Secretary Rodriguez is a graduate of Yale University, where he received his BA in history and political science. and NYU Stern Business School, where he received an MBA in finance. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today and sharing the governor's vision for our state. We welcome you as a friend to the Bronx and are grateful for your time in this briefing today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Michael. It's so delighted to be here with you. And of course, to Lisa, we know that we have you on double duty on that MTA board, so thank you for your service there as well. We're really excited to scratch the surface, really. I think that's what we're going to do in this hour on what is really a $200 billion budget, a tremendous document of priorities and really trying to build upon the budget last year, which was the governor's first. But I think many of the things you'll see will resonate in terms of some general objectives. And one of the things that is very important to the governor's initiatives focus on economic development. And when we see that, that's economic development, both big and small. We typically associate economic development with some of the bigger projects, but I want to make sure that we highlight that there's a variety of investments happening in the Bronx, large scale and small, that focus on making sure that we don't forget about any communities, certainly not the ones downstate, but we also have a similar focus on things upstate. It's really a balanced approach to make sure that we don't forget about any community and recognize that we are all still recovering from the pandemic. There are communities that are continuing to require additional investment, and we're in a position to be able to do that. So the next slide. And along those lines, while we will be talking about other things that are New York City focused, we would be remiss if we didn't also mention that New York is at a period of transformation statewide. We have been able to attract some significant businesses that is going to be good for the future of New York State moving forward, including in central New York, with an investment of almost $100 billion by Micron Technologies over the next 20 years, creating almost 50,000 new jobs, right? So while we always, focus and will continue to recognize that New York City is the engine of New York State, there's also significant opportunities that are happening upstate, which will just make New York State stronger and better in the future. So let's dig into what that looks like. Next slide. There's over $1.3 billion in economic development investments. Last year, we kicked off an Office of Workforce Development, and we continue to recognize that there are significant industries that need investment. As we talked about, we have this amazing opportunity in the tech sector around Micron and making sure that we create folks to be able to support that company's investment, not just in terms of direct employees, but indirect employees. But separate from that, we've talked about teachers last year. We've talked about nurses. We've talked about the transition around climate change jobs. So all of that continues, and also making sure that in these efforts, MWBEs, and our focus on that continues. We look to continue to build upon our executive orders to make sure that we are, one, utilizing MWBE businesses in this expansion, and also making sure that we're looking to connect workforce opportunities to every community, including those that are historically and economically disadvantaged. So it's very important that we look at workforce in that realm. These are the jobs of the present and the future, and we just don't get there if we don't invest in the people to be able to get there. Some other key initiatives that we put out there is recognizing that low-wage workers are feeling the pressure of inflation even more so than other communities, even in light of some of the actions that we took in terms of raising the minimum wage to $15. So what we're proposing is indexing the minimum wage to inflation. So when it hits $15, as it's been scheduled through extensive negotiations, at that point that they hit $15, they will then potentially index to inflation, giving people time to adjust to that time frame and make the preparations for the future. when we talk about the investments that are happening in smaller communities, we mentioned already the mega projects, but two really important initiatives are our Downtown Revitalization Initiative and our New York Forward Initiative. Those are two initiatives, $200 million run out of the Department of State in partnership with our brother and sister agencies, ESD and New York Homes, that focus specifically on revitalizing downtown communities. Downtown revitalization is generally $10 million awards awarded to each region of the state. And we focused also on making sure that we got even smaller than $10 million. We recognize there's some towns and villages that maybe don't have $10 million worth of projects. And in New York City, we know that's probably not too many, but we do know that there's some communities that are smaller that could use $5 million awards, or approximately $4.5 million. So this year, we launched our first round of New York Forward, and hopefully you saw those announcements, but the Garment District and Far Rockaway were the New York Forward recipients for $4.5 million. Kind of giving you an idea of the scale. We try to pick a smaller neighborhood and focus and target that investment there. And for downtown revitalization, around 6, it was East Harlem. And we mentioned these two because when our budget is approved in April, we're scheduled to have round 7 of our DRI, of which the Bronx was a winner in our second round. So we mentioned that, and before the call, we talked a little bit about the Bronx civic area community and the different projects that we're doing in the Bronx around that $10 million. And I'll actually show you that on the next slide. But I flagged that because this year we're going to take applications for both of those rounds again. Generally around the June timeframe is when we put out our application for round 2. And we certainly want to hear feedback from this body about where are the opportunities in the Bronx. In particular, where are there significant investments that are happening where the DRI or New York Forward can be the icing on the cake, the thing that helps take these big projects and connect them to the community in a meaningful way. So that's what we're looking at for those investments. And we definitely would be very interested in making sure that the Bronx participates. That's done historically through the borough president's offices. And I know you guys have a wonderful relationship with them. So you can help flag for Vanessa, which of those communities are on the verge that have significant investments that, that need some supportive funding. So that's what we're there for, in addition to $150 million for capital funding through the Regional Economic Development Council initiative. And their application also comes out in June. That's our consolidated funding application. And you'll hear a little bit more about that because that's the general funnel. So amongst those two programs, different applications, hundreds of millions of dollars available that are broken down by region, and we want to see the Bronx continue to do that. In addition, there's $58 million for tourism, and that's an extension of our Market New York fund. So many resources there, 2 ways to get it, either through our office or through the consolidated funding application process. But really exciting areas just to make sure that it's not always about the mega projects, it's about those investments in communities that we realize are equally important and equally transformative. So to the next slide. So this is what we've been up to in DRI round 2 in the Bronx. The Bronx Create Space. What I want is we helped with the demo, and I know we're trying to finish that up and get that theater built up because it's a wonderful space. The Andrew Friedman Home for Cultural Arts Center, Bronx Works. The skate park, I assume, just to tie in, we're probably going to be looking at more capital to those other areas to try and get to that goal and rely on our partners for that, and also potentially look at EPF dollars in the CFA process. But we know that there's significant streetscape and plaza improvements that are moving along. With any luck, we'll be done with those this year. BOEDC is working on the Bronx Hall Walk of Fame, as well as the Business Improvement Fund. So keep that in mind. There's $1 million there to help small businesses. in the Bronx be able to better connect in this civic center downtown area. So it's a targeted investment for business in that location, as well as trying to improve broadband and garden access to a number of gardens in the South Bronx. That's an example of how we've targeted one community in our DRI process, just to show it's not always about the mega projects, which the Bronx has, which we're going to talk about. It's also sometimes about the smaller investments in communities that are equally transformative and not just being done by the city of New York. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. So transportation. Actually, one of the things that I didn't mention in the previous slide, which is worth mentioning, is our brownfield opportunity area. So for all of our commercial real estate folks and our developer communities, we have had a number of different brownfield opportunity areas around housing, but there's also one on the Harlem River that's focusing on 63 potential brownfields, almost 200 acres, that little strip of greenway, which we continue to hear that people want, that go all the way from West 49th all the way up to where the Harlem River meets the Hudson River. And we know that there are people who are and have continued to look at developments in that space, in addition to the park around Yankee Stadium and ways to connect that greenway. That is an area that is still ripe for development. We have brownfield opportunity area tax credits. That's the reason why we have this BOA designation, for being able to make improvements around that area. So that's another important area that we look to continue to focus attention on in the Bronx. But when we talk about transportation, some of the most significant projects in our transportation capital plan are happening in the Bronx. I think everyone is aware of Hunts Point and the Interstate Access Improvement Project that continues to be underway, a $1.7 billion project. We continue to move that along to make sure that we have connectivity from the Bruckner to the Sheridan and to Hunts Point. So that's going to keep moving forward. So that's another important area. And then along those lines, in that area, you also have bridge replacements that are happening, the Bronx River Bridge replacements that allow for commercial train traffic to bring goods into the Bronx, requires significant rebuild impacting the East Tremont Avenue MTA Union Courtyard, and then the Bruckner Expressway Bridge rehab, right? So a lot of work happening in those areas that continue to be part of the DOT plan, almost $500 million worth of work in those two projects alone. So those are just some of the things that are Bronx specific. We always know that people care about roads and bridges and potholes. So, we continue to support the city through our CHIPS program, in addition to making significant investments directly through our Pave New York program and our Extreme Winter Recovery program. So, as you're driving around, know that we're doing our part in conjunction with the city to make sure that our potholes are addressed and that our roads and bridges are where they should be. MTA is really where the heart of the matter is for the 5 boroughs. So we put forward a number of significant proposals to make sure that they can continue to move ahead with their capital plan, of which includes the 4 Metro North stations for the Bronx, which is an anchor project and an equity conversation that the governor continues to be fully committed to, and falls in line with some of the other important capital initiatives around Second Avenue subway access, so that communities in Second Avenue subway phase 2, that communities that are historically disadvantaged and disconnected are finally connected. So that's one of the important initiatives around MTA, in addition to looking at interborough, in addition to making sure that we can make sure that there aren't significant cuts in safety. And Lisa is a wonderful board member who's going to make sure all that happens on time, on schedule. But in all seriousness, we know that much like other locations, Public transportation post-COVID continues to be on the rise, but not where it was. So it's important to be able to make sure that the investments that are needed to get people back on feeling safe, and also making sure that there's service available and not cut, really requires many of the actions that we're talking about to shore up the MTA. Next slide. One of the other pillars of our conversations in terms of budget policy is housing. When we talk, we have literally gone across the state. When we do DRIs, I go to communities big and small. I've represented East Harlem, and for a significant amount of time, the biggest issue is access to affordable housing, availability and access of affordable housing. So we have, of course, a $25 billion capital plan. That's one of the tools that's going to help us be able to get to this 800,000 homes over the next decade. But it's not going to happen by itself. It also requires significant motivation from the private sector. We've increased the tools to be able to hopefully get to that point, including converting commercial properties to residential, providing almost $85 million to also assist with basement conversions and bringing those up to speed and up to code, to help support that, encouraging accessory dwelling units, tax incentives for that, tax incentives for property tax incentives for multifamily affordable housing, as well as incentives for repairs for property owners that need help undertaking things. We also support our NPPs. These are the nonprofits that provide housing-based support to so many in our communities. There's a $6.7 million investment to continue to support those. And then we have to continue to support NYCHA. I think the trust is the single biggest, most important step towards being able to unlock federal dollars to be able to help make the restorations and the repairs in NYCHA, as well as building on the $1 billion that we have previously provided in previous budgets, and continue to work to implement. So those are just some of the things that we continue to build upon, in addition to incentivizing, and we are having a conversation about how we reach significant housing goals, because if we're going to get 50,000 jobs in central New York, there's no housing for 50,000 people there today. And when you talk about the housing pressures in the boroughs, there's not enough affordable housing for people, in addition to the 400,000 plus people we have on waiting lists in NYCHA. The numbers are broken. And if we don't take some significant action to be able to do that, that is in partnership with the private sector, we won't be able to be the beacon of growth and economic development that we want. It won't happen. And other places that don't have the restrictions on affordable housing will attract that investment. And we've been fortunate to get people to commit to New York and what it has, because we've made the investments in healthcare and in parks and recreations and communities. So all of that, all of that and the additional investments we're going to talk about here, say that New York is a good place to raise a family and to find employment, but we have to find a place to live too. So I just want to put a lot of attention there, because it's an ambitious goal, but not one that doesn't happen without the support of chambers and the business community. Next slide. So we've also put in $250 million to help water sewer in different areas to help us with that, as well as $20 million to help with planning and assistance around housing over the next decade. So it's important that we do those things to help support housing in the various markets. Next slide. Now it's almost like, we talk about economic development and you talk about housing, but you really can't have economic development if you don't deal with childcare. We have moved away from the place where the one income households just get it done. I mean, most of us, if not all of us, are relying on two income households, and that can't happen if there isn't significant childcare. That was one of the governor's key proposals last year, but recognizing there's more that has to be done in this area to be able to further support the variety of families that we have here. So one of the biggest things we've done is we've increased the eligibility for families to be able to access childcare and provide significant tax incentives for businesses that are providing access to or creating childcare programs, right? So we want to make sure that it's not something that's just going to be public sector driven. It really requires some support from the private sector and from businesses to do that. And we're going to try and incentivize businesses to be able to do that. So let's move on to the next slide. So we've committed $7.6 billion in childcare over the next 4 years, as well as increasing the availability for eligibility for folks who are low income and receiving support already. The bureaucracy around this was, clearly prohibitive, and there's an easier and faster way. So we're looking to make the tech innovations. And if you're receiving other forms of government support, then you would be enrolled and eligible. And being able to make that easier for people to enroll means we get increased access. But most importantly, just making sure that folks we've increased the eligibility from 83,000 to 93,000 for families of 4 to be able to qualify for childcare supports. So continuing to build into supporting communities, and childcare is huge. We also know that we've got to support the families, we have to support the providers, and we have to increase the number of providers that are there. So we've made significant investments around the childcare infrastructure, not just access. Next slide. So the governor has, since last year, stood up for public education and said she was going to make sure that the campaign for fiscal equity and made the most significant investments in public education ever. And she said she would do that moving forward, and she has. So what you see here is, again, making sure that we are meeting that commitment, even after the federal government's dollars have dissipated post-COVID, to make sure that we have over $500 million in school aid, as well as over $500 million in foundation aid, both of which represent an increase, bringing us to almost $13 billion that we write to the state. Next slide. What found within that is also expanded full day pre-K program. So we added $125 million for that, going back to the issue around supporting families, childcare, and availability and access, and also making sure that we focus specifically on trying to close that gap. We recognize that there are educational impacts to COVID, and looking to help establish tutoring and programs to help with learning loss is equally important. So that's in addition to the significant investments in foundation aid that were done around education. So healthcare, this is building on last year. I'm going to kind of gloss over it a little bit because there was such significant investment last year. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're adding on. There's an additional $1 billion in capital funding. Next slide. For healthcare institutions. I think some of your institutions will be very happy. The Bronx Nets and will understand that there's significant Bronx Care has significant dollars that are available there. Last year we made the Medicaid increases, so we continue to build on that. Last year we put in dollars for wages, so there continues to be support around that. But we also know that there's an opportunity for us to continue to put dollars into support the infrastructure around nursing homes. So there's $157 million invested to that in that area. But really the focus of investments, moving into our next slide, around healthcare and the healthcare system has, in terms of policy, is around mental health. And the governor has been clear about saying that she's dedicating $1 billion towards helping to support mental health services and the mental health care system in the state, recognizing that there's a significant impact in terms of support for addiction treatment services that is required. So there's $280 million focused on that, in addition to making sure that we are supporting veterans programs, not just treatment programs, but also educational case management, vocational assessment, job skills training, employment readiness, transportation, the whole gamut of things that are required to make sure that people are really able to exist in their communities, in addition to the supportive housing requirements that are necessary when we talk about the homelessness crisis, and how we deal with the fact that many of those who are homeless are also impacted by mental health needs and also require community-based services. So this is what we're focusing a significant amount of investment on, is re-engaging 1,000 beds for inpatient psychiatric units. We understand over the decade that this has been in decline, but clearly with the increase in mental health needs, these need to be put back online. In addition to that, we recognize that I think there were 37% of schools that did not have access to school-based mental health care. And I think it's important for us to address that, especially when we're dealing with our young people, especially when we're dealing about the level and impact of Latina suicide in the Bronx, how those numbers are startlingly high. But we also know that post-COVID mental health needs have only grown. So making sure that those are available in our schools matter. And then going back to the supportive housing issue, we recognize that homelessness and mental health are inextricably connected, and being able to provide 3,500 units of long-term housing will help us do that. We've also invested almost $20 million in shorter-term housing opportunities, inpatient beds and transitional housing to help deal with the immediate issue across the 5 boroughs, and not just in any particular community, because that's a sore point, not just for me as an East Harlem person, but I know for many people in the Bronx that it needs to be equitably distributed. So those are some of the ways that we're looking at engaging the $1 billion to help support one of the issues that we know has really grown in the last year or two post-COVID to help get us back on track. And then the other issue, and I think you have to talk about, is crime and safety. Next slide. And really making sure that we're leaning into a comprehensive approach. Next slide. That helps us deal with that. We have focused on dealing with the illegal gun issue, the steel pipeline, making sure there's an interstate task force that deals with the movement of guns. That's one of the issues. And some of the other issues that we know we have to continue to deal with is guns in our communities. So we're putting $337 million to help continue to deal with our violence interrupter programs, to help make sure that our community-based strategies to deal with gun violence prevention really increase. These started as pilots. We think they work. They're the best way to be able to get information on these and really put people on the ground in our communities in the middle of the night to help address what is happening in terms of gun violence and prevention. Also increasing our ability to track the crimes, increase our opportunities. Once you prevent the violence, how do these people get out of this cycle of violence? How do they get jobs? How do they get trained? How do our young people, actually do something meaningful? Those are all part of that $337 million that we're focusing on. And then the other issue is around the criminal justice system. We know that there's significant issues around, bail reform. We have put forward our recommendations on how to deal with that, including removing the least restrictive means, which I think a number of district attorneys have said has been an issue in terms of making sure that we get those people who are violent and make sure that we deal with those folks in a different way as those who have low offenses, criminal histories, and make sure that as the law was intended, they're not staying, in jail without bail because they can't afford it. That's the purpose of, the reform. We're going to keep that in place, but we are going to, also take the step forward to make sure that we can keep people who are engaging in repeated criminal activity and remove the standard that has been identified as an issue. So I think that's the second leg of our public safety plan, and then the third one is to help support our district attorneys who continue to need discovery support to be able to work through their cases and backlogs as a result of the initial bail reform changes. So $143 million to make sure that the system is working more efficiently as it should, and then looking to help address the state police deal with community stabilization units across the state, because this is not just a New York City problem. It's a Buffalo problem, it's a Rochester problem, it's a Syracuse problem. So it is happening not just in the boroughs or in the Bronx. It is something that has happened nationally in urban centers across the country. So we're looking to deal with it head on. Next slide. So when we talk about climate change, this is one of those things you kind of have to take a pause. In the CPA, we passed probably the most ambitious goals to try and reduce climate initiatives by 2030 and by 2045. So it's really important that we start to move in that direction to be able to make the changes that are necessary. So we're on that path. In addition, we passed a significant bond act to help us get there. So next slide. And when I say we, that's you, the voters. This went to the public referendum, so it's important for us to mention that these investments in terms of energy affordability and emissions and trying to lower and change the trajectory of New York really were on the ballot and have the support of the public. But most importantly, we recognize that any transition is not going to be easy. So we began this conversation with $200 million in relief for New Yorkers who are experiencing high electric bills right now. So that's a monthly discount for anyone making less than $75,000. That's available right now under our current utility discount program. We're also putting in support under our Empower Plus program for low-income retrofits to help people make the transition from in their homes to more energy efficient alternatives, as well as making sure that we put a task force together to help deal with that transition. So all of that is for today. I think what we're planning on, next slide, for the future is looking at a cap and invest plan. So really, for those corporations that continue to be high emission polluters, it's making sure that they are making the investments to the state to be able to help reduce emissions and reduce the impact for New Yorkers in this transition. So we're looking to put that in place. That will help generate revenues to be able to make that transition more effectively, to invest in the transition to solar and wind, and make sure that we can create those pipelines that are necessary to bring electricity and make the transition in all of our homes to more cleaner technologies. Also along those ways, part of that cap and invest is putting money into the pockets of communities that need them, including those who are paying higher rates as a result of transition. So you will continue to see support from the state as a result of this cap and invest program to help support not just large scale transmission and generation projects, but also to help the residential ratepayer as we go along. Also making sure that we put $400 million to help New Yorkers make that transition. Also $500 million for clean water infrastructure continues to be an issue for all of us in our bills. But also part of this climate conversation is $400 million that goes towards the Environmental Protection Fund And with that, many of those dollars eventually go towards solid waste programs, $115 million for parks and recreation. Also making sure there's $187 million for open space programs. So zoos, botanical gardens, and aquarium continue to get their investments as well. We're doing $18 million there statewide. And also within that is $25 million from municipal parks. So I mentioned some of the parks that continue to need investment. We'll get them in addition to making sure that we support those transformations that are already happening at places like Roberto Clemente. So really, this is where that EPF is where many of those resources continue to be generated to help support that. So next slide. Local governments is an area that we continue to invest in. Just the top line number for New York City, we're sending $20.5 billion to New York City. You know, we always hear it's never enough, but we're writing $20 billion is still $20 billion, in particular around education and making sure that we meet all of those commitments that we said we would. So just wanted to highlight that. Those are particular areas of investment. And then for my cultural arts organization, I can't forget them. There's $40 million for grants around that. So you can put that in under economic development because it certainly is one of those things that arts drive tourism, tourism drive people, and in addition to providing us significant awareness and investment in institutions across the state. So I just with that, I guess we'll pause for a minute. There's always more in the budget that we didn't cover, but we'll do our best to try and answer any questions or issues. And if we don't, we can certainly make sure that we'll get back to you. And we have Fidel, Marlene, and the team that cover the Bronx who can answer any specific items. So with that, I'll take a minute.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. This was a great presentation. And, you know, while we were listening, I was getting emails and texts saying thank you for the deep dive, because it's not often that we're able to get. There are a couple questions in the chat box. One of them is centered on food infrastructure. It says, with the growing New York State population, what are the plans to protect and develop the aging food infrastructure for the city and state of New York? In the chamber membership, we have the Hunts Point produce markets and several of the markets over in Hunts Point. So this is a large concern, predominantly centered around resiliency and ensuring that we can keep that food pipeline going. Do you have any insights that you could shed on that?
Well, one of the things that I would be remiss to mention is the investment in terms of refrigeration over at Hunts Point. Like that is our biggest agricultural investment, you know, in the state really. And Commissioner Ball is very proud of it. But we know that there continues to be a significant need for investing in our food infrastructure. That's why SNAP dollars matter so much. That's why our programming that we increased last year is continued in terms of our Nourish New York program. So I think we're starting to really do that. I think there's an opportunity for us to do more. And I think we're looking to really target how do we bring upstate produce, you know, and food into the downstate region more consistently. But we'll happily circle back around with those who are interested on specific food related programming.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The next question is on MWBE businesses. And for folks who are on the line, I invite you to email programs@bronxchamber.org. We have a robust MWBE program here at the Chamber to help you get your certification, but then also link you to public and private contracts to enhance your business. But in the MWBE realm, what are, you know, some key things the governor is proposing for this coming budget?
I think one of the most important things is making sure that we continue to expand the program. So there's significant investments in dealing with what is probably the single biggest issue, which is time and backlog, right? I think we're trying to make sure that those folks who are looking for MWBE certification are able to get that in a timely fashion. That's probably our single biggest issue that we're working on, in addition to looking at programs like reciprocity. So I think there's a stay tuned on that one in terms of how we implement that. I think there's a desire to be able to do that and identify and support our MWBEs. But I think the other thing is making sure that that continues to be an enterprise-wide focus. Like every agency, every contract, every license, you know, there's a lens on, are we meeting our 30% or 35% or higher goal, right? So I think it's important for us to continue to do that, identify the businesses, and really listen to chamber members for what you're experiencing. If we're falling short, we need to know. If there are areas that people feel are not available to them, let us know. You know, if they feel like, you know, we've had conversations with certain industries like, you know, gaming and mobile sports, like, okay, you know, is there MWBE participation there? We've heard that around concessions in airports where we've made significant investments. You know, so if there are industries that need to be targeted where we feel like there are not opportunities, let us know. We will look to do that because it had Jalissa Gutierrez, who's our Chief Diversity Officer. It's her goal to try and make sure that there's an enterprise-wide focus on this and that those numbers continue to move up. And I think so really hearing from you and all of our chambers is how we know if we're getting it right or we need to, you know, still make some adjustments.
Absolutely. Thank you for that very thoughtful response. MWBs are really crucial to our work in the state, and I thank you for that. The other subject that just popped up is a little bit of a hot potato issue on housing and the 421A renewal, extension, replacement, and where that is in the governor's proposal, and you know, if there's any flags or things that you know the legislature is pushing back on. Can you provide some color on 421A, the renewal, extension, or replacement?
You know, that's a good topic. I have to see what exactly our proposal does. I think we have something in there, and I read the article like everyone else did, you know, today on that, and I think it remains an important tool. We're not moving away from hot potatoes. You know, anybody who's read our housing proposals knows that we are pretty much throwing our hot potatoes out there. Some things we're trying to create that are incentive based. Some other ones that we're trying to create are mandate driven, including our, you know, 3% 3-year housing increase across the state if you're in a transit oriented or dense urban area, and 1% everywhere else. So we're putting it out there that this is what we need. And I'll have to circle back on what our latest iteration of the 421A proposal is, but I don't think I'm speaking out of school in terms of saying we don't have any legislative partners at this point. So it is very important that if people think it is worthy of additional investment and iteration, that they certainly reach out to Commissioner Dosnaukis in our New York Homes area to talk about what that could look like. And certainly, I'm going to put it out there because the budget is a conversation. We have started the conversation, but we require the legislature to participate in that conversation for us to get a budget done by April 1st. Thus far, you know, that it is widely reported that people have not seen, our legislators have not seen the value of 421A yet. So it is very important that if there are folks who are supportive of this or have recommendations on what the next iteration should be, that they literally communicate with the Bronx delegation, everybody, all of your assembly members, all of your senators, and get them on board to making a change. I think from our perspective, we want housing. We recognize the importance of supporting the real estate industry to do that. You'll see a number of tax, you know, property tax programs and incentives to try and get things moving in the right direction, and to help support additional housing, including, you know, additional benefits for affordable housing. So I think it's clear what the conversation that we want to have to get to 800,000, and it's important that other people figure out how to get there with a market-based approach. Not going to happen otherwise.
Absolutely. And I think, I think your words really resonate that, we need every tool in the toolbox to meet our housing goals. And, I think the governor made it very clear that, every New Yorker should have a right to a home. And I think that, you're on a clear path forward to making that happen. So thank you for that. And then last question, just selfishly, only because the chamber really worked hard on the city legislation to create what Councilmember Menon called the one-stop shop portal, where businesses could come in and have all their licensing done on one portal. Is there any way, only because it's your wheelhouse, because you head up the Department of State, that we could potentially have that linked with the city portal of One Stop Shop? Because Department of State receives all the businesses that come into New York State, but then they have to deal with all these myriad of applications and licensing on the city side. Is there any room to potentially have the city of New York partner with Department of State, that the city can get those pings with the new businesses arise and have that feed into the one-stop shop portal? It's in like infancy stages right now. The law just got passed, I think, in December. So I don't even think they're putting out an RFP for a designer yet, but just to think of how we can streamline the city and state process.
Well, Mike, that's really exciting. Thank you for that heads up. That way we can start to think about how to best integrate potentially with them. So that's a really good suggestion. We'll reach out to our counterparts in the city and see what's possible.
That would be awesome, and just a huge game changer, I think, and could possibly even work throughout the entire state. And that would be awesome. Well, Mr. Secretary, I think that we've gone through the entire list of questions and we're on time, which is so rare for government. So I love this. Is there any closing remarks that you want to convey to folks online today?
Well, I would just encourage everyone to take a look at some of our budget materials. We try to cover a broad section of things, but there's no question that there is more things of value in the budget, things that may be specific to a particular interest or a community group. Feel free to pass that information along. So there's always a lot more there than you think. But also, most importantly, is we're in that phase. When we get to probably another week from now, where our recommendations are done, and then going back to that conversation with our legislators, they have to hear from the community what's happening, what's going on, where do you need to make changes and relief. I think that's very important in terms of us getting to a point at April 1st that matters. So, I'm so delighted to be here and to hear some of the questions that come in. But I know for a fact when we talk to our business community in the Bronx, they have certain expectations about safety, crime, housing, the business supports, and it's important to see, to let us know if we're on the mark or off the mark, and let your legislators know, where you stand on the issues. That way we can have a productive conversation by April 1st.
Excellent, thank you. And for folks who are joining us, just to give you a bit of a loose time frame, so the governor issues her executive budget, and that's vetted by the public. And there's this amazing road tour that the secretary is participating in today to go and explain the budget. And then there are one House budget. So a budget comes from the Senate and a budget comes from the Assembly, and then the negotiating comes in. So the secretary is, suggesting rightly that if you have anything that's a priority, to reach out to your legislators, because that communication is so fundamental to shaping the budget negotiations in Albany. With that being said, Mr. Secretary, I thank you so much for joining the Bronx today. We really appreciate you being here. As Liz said during her opening remarks, you are a true friend of the Bronx, and we're so grateful to have you and the entire team from Governor Hochul's staff on board with us today. And we look forward to our continued partnership. So on behalf of the Bronx Chamber, thank you so much for all of your work.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. And for those who are attending, this video will be available on our YouTube channel, the new BXCC. It will also be available on social media. And a recap of this session will also be sent to all attendees. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. For more news, please feel free to follow the Bronx Chamber of Commerce on social media using the handle @the_new_BXCC. We are grateful for everyone who joined us today, especially Liz Neumark on our executive board and CEO and founder of Great Performances Catering, and Lisa Soren, the president of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce, as well as all of our board members. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon.